The sun didn't rise that morning. It hung there, dull and low, like a burden too heavy to lift. Wind clawed at the scrub grass, lifting dust like old ghosts. The horses' hooves made no sound on the packed earth. Only the wind moved, curling around rock and thornbush, dragging shadows long across the pale ground. Eldon Hayes sat tall in the saddle, though his shoulders slumped under a weight that had nothing to do with his coat or the rifle strapped behind him. He had ridden out days ago to find 3 missing cattle. He had found one, bloated and stinking, in a dry arroyo with its throat torn open. The other 2, he figured, had been taken or were long dead. Either way, he no longer cared. What he did not expect, what made him pull back slightly on the reins and narrow his eyes, was the figure lying still beside a burned-out campfire. The woman did not move. Her dress was torn, what was left of it, streaked in soot and dust. Her wrists were bound in front of her with rough hemp, too tight. One bare foot twitched once and then stilled. Her hair, dark and matted, fell over half her face. The other half was blistered red where the sun had licked her too long. Eldon didn't speak. He didn't curse, didn't sigh. He just watched. The desert said nothing back, only the dry rasp of wind through the brittle branches. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out once, and was gone. He dismounted slowly. His boots made soft prints in the dirt, which the wind was already working to erase. The smell of old ash lingered, sour and cold. Around the fire were half-finished princemen's boots. Likely 3 of them rushed, fading toward the canyon ridge they'd taken the others. This one, for whatever reason, had been left. Eldon didn't ask why. He looked down at her long, while her chest rose shallow and quick. Still alive, though barely. The bindings had cut into her skin, raw and pink beneath. Flies buzzed around her mouth. She did not blink. He stepped back and looked at the horizon. The clouds were moving east, heavy with dust, not rain. Somewhere behind them, the sun hung like a dead lantern. He considered riding on, but he did in single quotes t. Instead, he tied his horse to a mesquite stump and unslung the canteen from the saddle. He set it beside her, not close enough to touch, but within reach if she woke. Then he walked a few paces away, sat down on a flat rock, and waited. He didn't know her name. She didn't know his grief. He didn't expect her to wake. He didn't expect anything anymore. The fire had gone out long before he arrived. The ashes were scattered, like bones, gray and crumbling. The wind worried at them, lifting flecks into the air and spinning them away. He looked at them longer than he meant to. Something about the color reminded him of his daughter's hair, the fever, when it had turned brittle and pale, and began to fall out in clumps. He remembered brushing it away from her face, and how light her head had become in his hands. She had been 6. Her name was Laura. She had died in autumn, when the trees turned, but the air still held warmth. The doctor had said it was quick. Eldon knew better. He had heard every breath. He had buried her beside her mother, on the hill above the ranch. He had not cried. The dirt had been dry and hard, and he'd dug with blistered hands until his fingers bled. He hadn't spoken much since then. Now, as he sat on that rock, dust rising around his boots, he realized he still hadn't said a word, not to the woman, not to the wind, not to God. The woman stirred once, not fully, just a shiver, a twitch of the bound hands. Eldon watched her face. She wasn't young, maybe 30, maybe less. Apache, certainly. The lines around her mouth were deep, not from age, but from endurance. He wondered, briefly, what she had endured. And then, just as quickly, shut the thought down. He stood, brushed the dust from his pants, and walked back to his horse. He didn't leave. He didn't approach her either. He just stood there a while, looking at the burned-out fire, the tied hands, the wind moving like breath over her body. He waited for something, he didn't know what. The sun still hadn't risen. It just hung there, a weight behind the clouds, and the smoke that had once choked this camp had long since gone, leaving only silence. Silence, and a woman still breathing. Silence, and a man who hadn't for a long time. Asterisk. He still smelled smoke in his dreams, wood smoke, braided hair, and the faint sweetness of blood. Eldon built the fire with practiced hands. The sky had darkened, though the day had barely leaned past noon. The clouds hung thick, pulling the desert into early shadow. He set a ring of stones, stacked dry branches, struck the flint without hurry. Every motion he made was quiet, purposeful, hollow. The woman hadn't stirred since morning. She was still breathing. He could tell by the way the dust on her lips stirred faintly, rising and falling. That was enough. The flames caught. He watched them climb and crackle, then sat beside the heat, but just far enough that it didn't touch his skin. He didn't want warmth. Not really. The last time he'd lit a fire like this was 3 winters ago. Sarah had been coughing blood by then, the kind of wet cough that rattled from bone. He'd tucked every quilt they owned around her, built the fire so high it lit the stone chimney, and still she shivered. The doctor came late, left early, said it was the fever, same one that had taken half the town when she died. He'd been holding her wrist, not her hand, just the wrist, as if counting something he couldn't name. Laura had followed her mother into the ground the next spring. A rattler coiled beneath the porch steps, struck her twice. The child hadn't screamed, just sat down on the dirt and waited for someone to find her. Eldon had buried her himself. The pastor had offered to help, but Eldon said no. The man prayed anyway. Eldon hadn't bowed his head. Folks talked after that, whispered that something that had gone wrong in him, that a man who didn't cry at his daughter's grave might not be fit to live among others. He didn't argue. In truth, he hadn't cried because he didn't know how. Not anymore. There was no release in him, only a silence that got heavier each day, like snow that wouldn't melt. That silence filled him now. Even as the fire cracked and spit beside him, he stared into the flames but saw only the kitchen of the old house. The way Sarah used to twist her hair and tuck it behind one ear while she stirred the stew pot. He remembered her hands, thin and dark from sun, always smelling faintly of rosemary and ash. She used to tell him, back when the war was still fresh in his bones, pain doesn't make you strong. It makes you cruel if you don't hold it. He had laughed at her then, thought he was already strong. Now he knew better. The pain hadn't made him strong. It had made him a man who tied up his horse, built a fire, and sat near a dying woman without saying a word. He turned slightly, just enough to see her shape outlined against the sand. The fire threw a glow over her ankles, her wrists, the dark skin rubbed raw by rope. She had not made a sound. The cicadas began their slow, bone-dry rhythm. That sound always got under his skin like insects whispering about the dead. It sounded like bones breaking, soft and regular. He hated it. Night came on in layers. No moon, just the fire, just the silence. He leaned forward and dropped another branch onto the flames. They flared briefly, casting long shadows against the scrub and rock. His hands remembered the motion. His heart did not. Somewhere far off, a coyote called once and fell quiet. Eldon didn't answer. He hadn't spoken to a soul in weeks, maybe months, and now there was this woman, breathing but barely. She wasn't his burden, but she was there, and he didn't ride away. The fire popped once more, and the smoke curled upward, bitter and sharp, threading into the stars. It smelled like every fire he'd ever lit, like every goodbye he hadn't said. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he saw Laura's small fingers, grimy, stubborn, wrapped around a daisy route, and then the dream fell away. Just the wind, just the fire, and the hush of a night that hadn't forgiven him, but hadn't taken him yet. Not yet. Asterisk. She didn't speak when he cut the ropes, didn't flinch, just blinked, like waking from a different world. The blade slipped under the knot, and the frayed hemp fell away. Her hands dropped to her lap. She didn't rub her wrists. She didn't look at him. She only blinked once, slow, like someone remembering how to use their eyes. Eldon stood, his breath caught somewhere between his ribs and throat. He didn't say a word. She didn't either. She sat there in the dirt for a while longer, arms limp, body hunched against the cold, even though the sun had begun to warm the stones beneath them. He watched her from where he stood, unsure what to do with his hands, unsure what to do with the space between them. He thought she might cry. She didn't act by dusk. She had moved only once to lean forward and sip from the canteen he'd left. She drank slow, the water sliding down her cracked lips like something sacred. Then she looked at him for the first time. Just once. Her eyes were dry and dark, and in them was something that made Eldon feel as though she was seeing all the way through him, to the hollow places inside. They rode back together. She didn't sit behind him on the horse. He led it while she walked beside, limping slightly but never asking to stop. The silence between them had taken root, and they both seemed to understand it wasn't meant to be broken at the ranch. He motioned toward the empty tool shed beside the barn. It was half-rotted roof, patched with tin, but it had a door and a floor and 4 walls that kept out most of the night. She stepped inside without pause. The next morning, she was already up when he came out. She stood by the edge of the corral, staring at the horses with an unreadable look. Her arms were folded across her chest, and her hair, chopped uneven and still tangled with ash, fell around her face like a veil. He gave her a blanket. She took it with a nod. She didn't ask for food, but she didn't refuse it either. That first week she stayed close to the shed. By the second, she had begun tending the fire in the mornings, coaxing it to life before he stepped outside. By the third, she was sewing an old, torn top, her stitches crooked but steady. They still didn't speak. He had no name for her, and she offered none. It didn't feel necessary. There was something old in her silence, like stone or bone, something not easily cracked. Sometimes when he'd come in from mending fences or hauling feed, he'd find a small tin of coffee heating on the edge of the stove, or his coat mended, the buttons resewn. He never saw her do it. Things just happened. She worked in the same way the land did, quiet, unhurried, exacting. At night, she sat by the fire. Not beside him, not far, just enough that the light touched them both. Her face, in the flicker of flame, looked carved from something weathered and honest. The skin across her cheek had healed into a jagged scar, pale against her darker tone. She never tried to hide it. He watched her sometimes, when she didn't know, or maybe she did. He couldn't tell. There was a moment once when she lifted a lock of her hacked hair between her fingers, twirled it slowly, then fed it into the fire. One strand, then another. Each burned quick and blue at the edges, curling into ash. She watched them vanish, with a kind of reverence, Like farewell, she never smiled. But once, she hummed. Just a low sound, like a memory something half lost, rising and fading before he could place it. That night, a wind kicked up from the canyon, sharp and dry. It slammed the door of the shed open with a bang. The Castian skillet he'd left on the table clattered to the floor, rolling in lazy circles before settling. They both froze. Then, at the same moment, turned toward the noise, and met eyes. It was the first time. He didn't look away, neither did she. The fire popped between them, shadows swaying across the walls. Her gaze didn't accuse, didn't ask. It just was. Something shifted in the room, not loud, not sudden, but sure. He bent to pick up the pan and set it back on the table. She turned back to the fire, her hands still in her lap. Outside, the wind moaned through the cottonwoods, and the trees whispered like voices too old to understand. Inside, they sat in silence, but it no longer felt like a wound. It felt like waiting. Spring tried to return. Shoots of green poked through the ash, but the sky still looked like bruised skin. The snow melted slow that year. It lingered longer than it should have, clinging to the shady corners of the barn and the northern side of the hills like it didn't know how to let go. When it finally began to retreat, it did so in patches, leaving behind mud and bone-colored frost. Eldon noticed the mare limping before she did, or maybe she had seen it first and just waited for him to act. Either way, he found her kneeling beside the animal one morning, hands gentle on its leg, whispering words he didn't recognize. The mare stood still, trusting, breathing slow. The wound was old, half-healed wrong. Eldon had meant to fix it, never got around to it. He stood by the fence post and watched her wrap a torn piece of linen around the joint, tying it with care. She spoke to the horse in low tones, something round and soft, and Eldon realized it was the first time he'd heard her voice. It didn't matter that he didn't understand the words that night. He left his coat folded on the bench beside the stove when she came in from the shed. She took it without looking at him. In the mornings he began washing his face, just a splash of water from the tin basin, rough hands scrubbing its skin that had grown strange to him. He shaved the stubble that had clung for months, slow and deliberate, nicking his chin once. The blood surprised him how red it was, how warm. She kept fixing things. The rip in the old tarp, the broken strap on the water bucket, his flannel shirt, stitched across the shoulder with mismatched thread. He never asked her to. She never waited for thanks. The nights grew quieter, which was strange, because they had always been silent. But now the hush felt shared. A storm rolled through late one evening. Not hard, but steady. The rain tapped gently on the tin roof like fingers drumming a lullaby. They sat in the cabin, him with his hands around a chipped mug, her with her back to the wall. The fire glowed between them, soft and low. At some point, he must have fallen asleep. In the dream, Laura stood in the yard, bare feet in the mud, her dress soaked through and clinging to a tiny frame. She didn't move, didn't smile, just held the Apache woman's hand. The two of them looked at him, unmoving, unblinking, not accusing, not forgiving either, just there. He woke with a start, the mug still in his hands. Now cold, she was looking at him. He didn't speak, neither did she. Outside, the storm had passed. The smell of wet earth drifted in through the cracks in the wood. Somewhere, a frog croaked once, then went quiet. He went to the mirror the next morning, the one above the wash basin that hadn't been used in months. He wiped the dust with his sleeve and stared. The man who looked back at him was older than he remembered, not just in skin, but in eyes. There was something dulled there, something hollow, but there was also shape to his face again. Edges, color. The first signs of coming back. He didn't linger, just combed his hair with his fingers and went outside. She was feeding the chickens. The limp in her walk was less now. He saw her lift a chick, inspect its foot, and set it back down with care. He didn't say good morning. She didn't either, but he picked up the bucket of feed and walked toward her. The clouds had cleared by then, and a sliver of sun broke through the edge of the hill, warming the soil in patches. One drop of water slid from the eave of the cabin and splashed at his boot. The sky still looked bruised, but something underneath it had begun to soften. He didn't know what would come of it. Didn't need to dot it, was enough. For now, to walk beside her, and let the silence carry both their names. The trader came back on a Thursday early. The light hadn't yet reached over the ridge, and the cold still bit like it belonged to winter. Eldon had been splitting wood behind the barn when he heard the hooves. 3 horses. One man. He knew the rhythm before he saw the shape. Knew it from the way the dust rose to clean too fast, and from the sound the man made when he pulled the reins, like someone trying to own whatever he touched. The trader looked the same, wide mouth, sun-cut skin, boots defined for these parts. His coat was buffalo hide, but clean, no sweat, no labor. Just show well, the man said, sliding down. Ain't this a lucky find? Eldon didn't say a thing. She's still here? The trader asked, glancing toward the cabin like it was something he'd once misplaced. Didn't expect you to keep her this long. Thought you'd run her off or bury her. He spat in the dirt and walked a few steps closer. Hell, I was ready to count her gone. You did me a favor. Really? She's not much use anyhow. But the boys said I ought to check. Eldon let the axe rest against the stump and straightened. She inside? The man asked. Or did she crawl off somewhere? Still, Eldon didn't speak. The trader grinned, like that silence amused him. Look, I know she ain't worth much, but there's a fella down near the river who trades for cheap labor. She'll work a kitchen or a field, or maybe nothing at all, just needs to fill a wagon. He took a step closer. Eldon moved with him, slow, not threatening, just standing between the man and the door. The wind stirred then, lifting a curl of dust that danced between them and drifted toward the corral. The sun began to rise behind the clouds, not gold, not soft, just a dull glow, the kind that hurts your eyes but never warms you. The trader looked down, saw Eldon's hand resting on the rifle at his hip, not drawn, not pointed, but there. Now, the man said, raising both palms slightly. No need for that. Eldon didn't blink. She ain't yours, the trader added. You were just holding her, like a misplaced saddle or a stray dog. I got paper says she's mine, if you care about that sort of thing. The silence hung like smoke. The trader shifted once, then again, then finally turned. Fine, he muttered. You want her, keep her, ain't worth dying over. He mounted his horse with a grunt, dusted his coat like the place offended him, and rode off without another word. The sound of hooves faded slow into the morning, swallowed by the stillness of the plain. Eldon didn't move. He stood there, hands still near the gun, eyes fixed on the place where the man had disappeared. The wind picked up again harder now, carrying grit that stung his cheek and made his eyes water. He didn't blink it away. Behind him the door creaked. She stood in the threshold, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, bare feet on the wooden step. She hadn't made a sound, but he felt her there, like breath in the cold. He turned only enough to see her. She didn't ask what had been said. She didn't ask if he would have used the gun. She just reached one hand out, touched the doorframe. Beside her, fingers trailing along the splintered wood like someone marking the edge of something real. Her eyes didn't leave his. And in that moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to say. The dust kept moving, rising around the fence posts, swirling past the window glass and across the porch floor. But Eldon didn't step away. He stayed there, between her and the world, long after the trader had gone. Long enough for the wind to die down, long enough for the silence to settle again. Not heavy this time, but whole. And when he finally stepped back toward the cabin, he didn't close the door. He left it open behind him. ***, when the sun finally rose. Rosette did so slow and gold and merciful, like something had forgiven them both. The frost was gone by then. Not just the frost on the ground, but the kind that lived in the quiet between walls. The kind that lingered on the edge of thought and curled its fingers around every memory that refused to soften. She said her first word in English while pointing at a bird. Her voice cracked a little, but the word came clear, like something she'd been practicing in her head for days. Eldon didn't answer right away, just looked where she pointed and nodded once. That was all she needed. After that, more words came, one at a time. Not every day, not for conversation, just names. Stone, she said one morning, holding a round one she'd picked from the garden bed. Wind, she whispered as it tugged at her hair. Fire, one night when the coals danced hotter than usual and her hands hovered above them, open like a prayer. Eldon kept his silences, but they changed shape. They no longer closed him in. He began walking the fields again, mapping out what might still grow in dirt long neglected. She followed, sometimes trailing 2 steps behind, sometimes ahead. He laid down the rifle. It still leaned in the corner, oiled and ready, but it was no longer a part of him. He didn't check it each morning, didn't keep it close at dinner. It rested beside the broom now, quiet, like a memory no longer needed. She didn't sleep in the shed anymore. One night she moved her things to the main house, not with ceremony or words, just carried them in a blanket, a small basket of mended cloth, a smooth stone shaped like a bird. He didn't ask. She didn't explain. They shared the stove, the table, the water basin, but not the bed. That space between them still held, not from fear, not even from hurt, but from something else, something like reverence. Eldon began clearing a patch near the southern fence, the place that caught the most sun come spring. The ground there was stubborn, full of rock and old roots, but he turned it with steady hands. One row, then another dot. She joined him one morning with a bundle of seeds folded in a strip of cotton. Didn't say what they were, just pressed them into his hand and pointed. They worked side by side in silence, fingers deep in the dirt, breath even, steady. Once, as he paused to stretch his back, she laid her palm on the place where the soil was softest, held it there for a long moment, then looked up at him. He didn't smile, but he nodded, and that was enough. That night, the fire crackled warm and low, and they sat closer than before, shoulders not quite touching, knees pointed toward the hearth. She stitched a torn sleeve while he carved notches into a bit of wood for the fence. Outside, the moon rode high and pale, casting soft light across the field they'd just begun. He wanted to tell her Laura's name, wanted to speak it aloud for the first time in what felt like lifetimes. But the words didn't come, so instead, he passed her a cup of warm milk, and she took it without question, cupping it between both hands. Later, as she stood to head toward her corner of the room, she paused. looked at him, not with question, not with invitation, just looked, and he looked back. There was no need to say her name. He didn't know it, but that no longer felt like absence. It felt like something waiting to be offered, when the time was right. Morning came slow the next day. Eldon stirred at first light, the sky outside a wash of soft peach and blue. He sat on the edge of the bed, pulled on his boots and paused. Something had shifted again. Not in the cabin, not in the air. In him. He walked out barefoot, cool wood under his soles, and stepped onto the porch. From the chimney, a thread of smoke rose thin, clean, unhurried. Inside, he could hear the crackle of kindling and the soft clink of iron against stone. She was stoking the fire. Her hand, he imagined, moving with the same careful rhythm as always. The wind was still for once. He stood there a while, watching the sky grow gold at the edges, the frostless ground beginning to breathe again. Didn't feel forgiven, not exactly, but he no longer felt cursed, and that was something. He turned back toward the door. The sound of her footsteps soft behind him. Maybe, today, they would plant the barley. Or maybe not. It didn't matter. The smoke didn't sting this time. It just rose, pale and slow, into the clean sky.